delighted now to welcome the panelists for our next panel. What did we decide to do, Ilse? Are we going to bring everybody on stage? I think it's better. We'll have a presentation by Scott, I'll say that in a minute. So please, Luc Hindryckx, who is Director General of ECTA. We were going to have Marit from ETNO, but she called me with a small voice this morning. You know, not a good day for me. So Paolo Grassia kindly accepted to step in. Thank you very much, Paolo, for stepping in at short notice. We have Dan Sjöblom, who I don't need to introduce to you. That's the past of BEREC. No, they're talking about Dan, great to have you, Director General of PTS, and he was BEREC chair last year. And finally, Kamila Kloc, where are you, Kamila? Who is the head of unit of B3 in DG Connect and hold the sway on the matter that we will discuss now, which is the future of both the recommendation on NGA, the recommendation on access and non-discrimination. To pave the way for our panel, we will have, the Commission has commissioned a study has been carried out by Scott Marcus and my friend Christian, sitting there in a corner, quietly. Scott is taking a short holiday in Würzburg, beautiful part of Germany now, so he can't be with us, but he's there. Hello, Scott. Great to have you.
To begin with, I'd like to thank the organizers. I'd like to thank BEREC and the BEREC office for having made it possible for me to make this presentation remotely instead of having to be on site. It would have been very difficult for me to be on site today. So I'm going to be talking about a study of regulatory incentives for deployment of very high capacity networks. Many of you will have already read the study. What the study seeks to do is to provide advice to the Commission in updating the NGA recommendation from 2010 and the Non-Discrimination and Costing recommendation, or NDCM, from 2013. The study takes the European Electronic Communications Code, the EECC, as a firm starting point. And it's important to remember, it was not our task to evaluate the code, which would in any case not have been very practical. The code was only due for transposition in December of last year, and in many of the member states has still not been transposed. So it's how the code is working. But that represents the starting point for successor recommendations. Now, the study benefits from a lot of work that was done. It benefits from desk research, it benefits from a Commission public consultation, which quite a few people in the audience will have responded to, a number of interviews, surveys of NRAs, surveys of market players, and in-depth member state case studies. It also benefits from 2 workshops, one with BEREC members, another, once again, with market players, plus academics and other experts. I was the author of the recommendations and the chief economist on the study. I had the pleasure of working with Christian Ospie, a very fine legal expert that many of you know, and a good support team from Visionary Analytics, a Lithuanian company. Now, a lot has changed since the recommendations were first enacted in 2010 and 2013. There have been changes in the goals that the European institutions are seeking to achieve in broadband. There have been changes in the regulatory framework itself as we switch from the old regulatory for electronic communications to the new EECC. And also, there are substantial changes in the evolution of the markets in many of the member states. So a lot needs to be dealt with in the new recommendations. There was a lot that we needed to think about. I'm on slide 3 now. Now, in the EECC, there are 2 main objectives that are relevant throughout the study, and this is kind of an overarching theme. On the one hand, there's a promotion of innovation and investment, which had actually always been in the regulatory framework for electronic communications, but there'd been relatively little in the active code to try to implement it. There's also an emphasis on competition. What we see in the code is something of a shift in emphasis where the innovation and investment prong plays a stronger role, but the code doesn't really prioritize between the 2 and makes clear that competition needs to be preserved. And we've attempted to follow that line throughout. What I'm going to be talking about today relates to four of the main topics that we considered: price regulation and pricing flexibility, which really need to be considered together, non-discrimination, access to civil engineering infrastructure, and the migration from copper to fiber. There are 49 distinct recommendations in this study. It's a very detailed study. It's not possible to present them in full detail today. I'll try to quickly walk through the main ones. I'll be skipping a couple of areas, notably cooperative agreements and geographic differentiation. And with that, let's get into the pricing issues. I'm on slide 6 as of now. So, Article 74 of the Code establishes pricing flexibility as a preferred approach when suitable conditions have been fulfilled. And that's clear. And again, it's a bit of a shift relative to what we find in the text of the old regulatory framework. Now, pricing flexibility is clearly the default option, but in many cases, the conditions in the code that are required to achieve it are a bit less restrictive than those in the recommendations. What we're recommending is that the recommendations more closely follow the code in a couple of key aspects. One is that non-discrimination should be treated as being effective. Equivalence of input is certainly a way to get there, but it may not be the only way. So we believe the access recommendation should be a little less firm on this point. Also, the recommendations talked about a copper anchor. Again, the code speaks more of a pricing constraint. We think that what would be useful here would be guidance in the successor recommendation on what a successor to copper might be in the member state, if there is indeed an appropriate successor product. The economic replicability test is one of the key functions that goes into the pricing flexibility, but it's complicated. And what we've seen is that the NRAs face many practical problems in implementing it, and that there's considerable variation across the member states, which is in and of itself not necessarily a problem, but it hints at the difficulty of what's to be done. So on the one hand, we think that the principles for choosing ERT flagship products need to be better defined in the recommendation. The NRAs themselves said this would be useful for them. We think that in cases where the flagship product is a bundle, more guidance is needed, especially in cases where the bundle includes both regulated and non-regulated aspects. Relatedly, in the case where there are non-regulated bits, we think it's important that the recommendations emphasize that there is still an information obligation on the SMP operator to provide information about services that are unregulated if that information is needed in order to conduct the ERT and to break out the relative costs of the component within the ERT. Now, as far as scale adjustment, there's a fair bit in the recommendations, but it's actually inconsistent in some key respects, particularly in the aspect of equally efficient competitor versus scale-adjusted, reasonably efficient competitor. We think that the successor recommendation needs to make clear the principles here on which this should be chosen and the principles on which an appropriate scale should be selected. There's an open question also as to how to handle long-term discounts of various forms in conducting the ERT. We believe clarification here would be useful in most cases, but not all. The discounts should be ignored. And as far as timing, we actually thought the timing in the current recommendation is reasonably okay, but we observe that BEREC has indicated there are cases where they have trouble getting through the ERT in the 4 months that are allowed. Some additional guidance may be appropriate. We think that this is something that the NRAs and the Commission ought to be discussing to see if there's a way to do this without ballooning the time in which the ERT is conducted, which we think would be a bad thing to do. For the transparency is important. That doesn't seem to be always as well adhered to as it could be. A key point is that the markets have changed. We now have many member states, or at least several, where there are wholesale competitors that are facilities-based, that compete on the basis of their own fiber. And in those cases, the classic approach to price control may not be so appropriate. Historically, we were mainly looking at retail competition where it was important that the wholesale price be as low as possible or as low as could be justified. However, for facilities-based competitors, it's important that they not be too low. So here there are constraints on both sides. A nuanced approach seems to be needed. Price regulation is what's done when there's not a basis for providing price flexibility. We think that the price band that appears in the current recommendations is really no longer relevant and should be gotten rid of. There's very complicated guidance on how to handle SMP's civil engineering infrastructure, CEI. New infrastructure is supposed to be handled pretty much the same as everything else, using current costs and bottom-up LRIC. But reusable old or existing CEI should instead be priced based on the regulatory asset base, adjusted for depreciation and with an adjustment for inflation. So a complicated approach. We think the approach is basically right, but again, we see cases in the member states where it seems to be implemented not ideally. We think additional guidance from the Commission would be useful here. We have provided some detailed suggestions in the study. The risk premium is a key issue. And with that risk premium, the regulation, the ECC, tries to provide compensation to network operators, not only for direct costs, but also for the additional risk that they incur in rolling out historically NGA, today VHCN. So a separate number, separately computed number added to the WACC is used to do that. And the question that we raise is everything reflected in that NGA risk premium that ought to be? We see two areas where we think that, at least in some of the member states, there may be a basis to make additional adjustments. One of them is that the current process leads to frequent downward adjustments in the NGA risk premium, arguably sooner than is appropriate relative to the risks that were incurred by the SMP operator when they first made the investments and when they first reached the investment decision. We think that a smoothing algorithm might be a simple way to address this. This is essentially the same concern that the UK tried to address with their so-called fair bet approach, but we think the fair bet approach doesn't really provide enough guidance to NRAs on how it could be implemented on a sustainable and structured basis. So we think that rather more promising. Another aspect that we think is not taken into account and could be is the so-called real option that the SMP operator effectively surrenders when they make a decision to build out. An SMP operator often has an option to delay deployment in order to wait for more information to come in and therefore to have less uncertainty about the return on the investment. They're effectively cashing that option in when they decide to go forward and build. And the value of that option can be calculated. We have an example, a proof of concept where this was done in Italy. We think that this is something that may be appropriate, at least in some of the member states. The recommendation shouldn't rule it out. That brings us to another topic, non-discrimination, also a complicated topic. As previously noted, we don't think that equivalence of inputs is the only way to get to good non-discrimination. What we've heard in all of our interviews and our workshops is that non-discrimination based on a well-implemented equivalence of outputs can be as good or nearly as good as equivalence of inputs, but this depends crucially on things like the KPIs, the service level agreements, service level guarantees, and also on the quality of enforcement. So again, we think that the focus should be on effective non-discrimination with a bit more flexibility on how it's obtained, but still an emphasis that it has to be effective. Now, there are cases in the member states where competitors need quality of service beyond that offered in the reference offers. We think, for example, of branch banks in France. We don't think that that should be prohibited just because there's no reference offer for it. We also see a continuing problem with the SMP operator using the information that it gains by selling its wholesale offerings to benefit its own retail operations. It's already prohibited, but it seems to still be an issue, and it's an issue that BEREC itself has acknowledged on occasion. we think that something needs to be done about this to strengthen the provisions that are already there. Again, KPIs, SLAs, SLGs, they play a key role in making non-discrimination effective. We think that a multi-stakeholder process might, in many cases, be the best way to determine what those values ought to be, but a multi-stakeholder process led or managed or monitored by the NRA. Enforcement, again, is important. Penalties have to be large enough to be dissuasive. That's already in the recommendations, but it doesn't seem to always be implemented. And last but not least, the penalties need to be predictable enough in being enforced and the timing in which they're enforced that they really have dissuasive effect. That clearly is not always the case. Again, more needs to be done here. With SLGs, it's not so easy. With KPIs, those are implemented by the NRAs. We think more can be done in that area. Access to civil engineering, another major topic. There are three main mechanisms in the code for providing access to civil engineering. The first is regulated access to the CEI of the SMP operator. The second has to do with symmetric. The third is access to a wide range of infrastructures under the Broadband Cost Reduction Act, Directive, the BCRD. We have very little to say about the BCRD because it's being separately evaluated, separately reviewed. We also didn't have a whole lot to say about symmetric access. Most of what we focused on was the SMP CEI. We think there may be cases where it's appropriate to provide access to CEI that isn't directly itself subject to SMP. And this is something that will require a little thought as to how the NRA implements it. It could in principle be done in some instances under Articles 72 and 73 of the code. A more sustainable approach might be to do it using a physical infrastructure access market, a separate market, which is a possibility that's already envisioned in the recommendation on relevant markets from 2020. The SMP operator shouldn't be able to turn down a request for access to CEI just because it's being used for something other than FTTH, notably cable. And also we think in cases where there's been a consistent history of the SMP operator failing to renovate or expand SMP CEI, we think there ought to be an option whereby the NRA could require the SMP operator to certify third-party maintainers who could do the work and processes that they could follow such that the work could be initiated directly on request of a competitor. So this would be a bit of a change, but in fact, processes like this exist in a couple of the member states. We think it's a promising approach. Now, on the migration from legacy infrastructure, again, there were a few points here. The first has to do with notice periods. We think that a notice period shorter than 5 years makes sense. 5 years is rarely used in the member states anyway. And we also think that there needs to be more differentiated treatment to allow a distinction between locations that are actually used versus those that are not. As far as revising the notice that the SMP operator has to give, we think that it makes sense to follow practice of, for instance, France, in making a distinction between commercial closure, the point at which new orders are no longer accepted, versus technical closure when the facility is specifically closed down. I would argue strongly that it's not the role of the NRA or the government to tell an SMP operator when to shut down its copper network. We think that this is a business decision that the network operator ought to be able to make on its own. We do see possible merit for the NRA in suitable cases and with suitable protections to deregulate the price of legacy copper once the migration to fiber is well underway, and again, under suitable protections. Finally, for the migration process, just as with the definition of KPIs, SLAs, and SLGs, we see a lot of opportunity to engage the member state stakeholders, competitors and SMP alike, in a collaborative, multi-stakeholder process to actually oversee the migration process and to try to find ways forward that make sense for all players. Again, a multi-stakeholder process moderated or monitored or overseen by the NRA. And those are the recommendations that we made. With that, I really look forward to what I think will be an extremely interesting discussion among regulators and market players. I'm very much looking forward to it, and I'd like to hand the baton back to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Scott. Thank you. Let's start with you, Luc. Luc, Director General of ECTA. What do you make of these? Let's start. There is a lot to be said, so go ahead. Or you can sit. Okay, fine. Sure.
Yeah, so thank you, BEREC, for the organization of this panel that put the Stakeholder Forum at the very core activities of its very core activities, I mean the economic regulation. And thank you for inviting me, and also thank you for this full organization of the Stakeholder Forum. Many in the room, or at least several in the room, remember the difficult delivery of the recommendation in 2013, and particularly the last plenary of 2012, where this was discussed with the Commission. The Commission had genetically modified the embryo to such an extent that not only would the child have been much less competitive, but also would have made childbirth impossible, even with the help of forceps. Fortunately, the genetic modification have been seriously mitigated by BEREC. Thank you for that. Unfortunately, not completely, and today we have to evaluate what to do with this pre-adolescent keeping the stigma of these modifications. The temptation for some is great to take back the genetic modification and make him even less competitive. The time is too short to cover all the points, so I will limit myself to 3 points of form and then 8 points of substance. On the form, the first point. I wonder whether it is the Commission that gave the instruction or whether it is the consultant who misinterpreted the wording regulatory incentive. Because it seems that the study is so biased in favor of the incumbents, just like the workshop. Similarly, why were the last studies commissioned by ECTA not taken into account by the consultant when in the 136 references in the list are full of studies of documents and documents funded by the incumbents and their clubs? My second point. Regulatory incentive does not mean how can we help the incumbent to remonopolize the market, nor how can we deregulate more. And even less, does regulatory incentive mean deregulation? In the same vein, the number of markets in the recommendation on relevant markets is not a KPI. You do not conclude that there is less crime after you decriminalize most crime. The study should have been done with an holistic approach and starting with recognize the fundamental role of alternative operators as investment engine. However, it doesn't. Competition drive investment. Unfortunately, we do not see how the study outcomes will give better fuel to the investment engine. Even if the recommendation concerns the regulatory treatment of SMP operators, you can still choose to boost the competitiveness of alternative operators and hence give the investment engine better fuel. The third point on the form. Competition drive investment is explained in corporate finance by the cash flows that you should be taken into account when calculating the net present value of a project. With the manner they are quoting Dixit and Pindick, they ignore the notion of incremental cash flows, the incidental effect, and the opportunity cost when calculating the NPV of a project. Cash flows with the project must be compared to cash flows without the project, as clearly explained by Braley, Meyers, and Allen in their book, Principle of Corporate Finance. We can only note that they are not part of the references, although they are seen as the reference in corporate finance. Not taking this into consideration is a major flaw of the study. And this also means that by closing doors too quickly, you reduce the option, and by not putting the competitive seats at the beginning of the study, it seems possible to have a more competitive harvest. On the substance, let it be said, many ECTA members exhibit investment rates far above the incumbents. Just to mention a few. Iliad in France, Italy, and Poland, Fastweb in Italy, Massmobile in Spain, Eurofiber in Germany, the Netherlands, France, Belgium, with investment rates around or above 30% year after year. And even, for example, Iliad with 39% in 2009. From 2015 to 2025, Iliad's investment will be in total 25 billion euro. 25 billion euro. My first point on substance, on the risk and the risk premium. Compared to 2010 and 2013, the macroeconomic situation of the VCHN investment has significantly changed. The uncertainty listed in Annex 1 of the engineer recommendation have been lifted. Fiber deployment activities are more mature. Companies have significantly gained in managerial and operational experience. Skills have been developed, and this all over Europe. And most of all, the COVID crisis and the unstoppable trend towards digitization confirm that all expectations at the time in terms of demand are far exceeded. Hence, the notion of additional risk premium has lost its relevance. Additionally, operators having SMP, mainly the incumbents, can reduce their risk and have economical incentive to co-invest without deregulation. The co-investment agreement between Proximus and Eurofiber in Belgium and Telenet and Fluvius that was announced, the memorandum of understanding today, are real paradigm shifts. Furthermore, and then I congratulate the Hungarian NRA, as they mentioned, there is no compelling need to introduce special other risks, since industry risks are covered by the beta, which together with the relevant equity risk cover the systematic risk. The telco beta reflects that they are investing the majority of their capex into fiber and that the related potential risk is thus reflected in the market. Fiber investment is a reality, financial markets have integrated that, and stock market even the more. My second point, equivalent of input versus equivalent of output. We do not understand why the study put so much emphasis to try to convince about equivalence of output. Equivalence of output has demonstrated its inability to prevent discrimination. Lack of proper enforcement and non-discrimination of obligations has led to severe process failure, inferior installation and repair performance for alternative operators, causing several market exits. Several alternative operators have been confronted to the ultimate punishment, meaning market exit. Has any incumbent ever been put out of the market? Not to my knowledge. In a VCHN context, equivalence of input must be the norm. My third point, the transition from copper to fiber. ECTA supports a quick and voluntary transition under the following condition. First, clear and transparent process discussed and agreed with the access taker, including KPIs, service level and dissuasive penalties in case of breach, that allows smooth customer transfer with the appropriate fiber product and the services to substitute the copper-based product. The second point, the copper to fiber transition requires stable wholesale prices and adequate quality of service and wholesale products, services and processes. Third, copper switch off, commercial or operational, means copper switch off for everybody, even the more the incumbent. If alternative operator cannot use copper anymore, whatever the product or services are, the incumbent should also not be allowed to use it. Fourth, price control and non-discrimination are two fundamental different dimensions. 5, it's too early to move away from cost-based regulation. Moreover, there is no evidence that a reduction of ex-ante regulation would encourage incumbents to invest. I invite everybody to look at the French situation. Even the more, the EV investment cycle requires a long-term vision of the industry and does not match stock market expectation. Equity investors in telecom stock want significant short-term cash generation. I invite everybody to read the post of Thomas Reynaud, the CEO of Iliad, when he explained why they get out of the stock market. 6, an economical replicability test is not a substitute for cost orientation of SMP operators, wholesale chargers. It is a verification mechanism for economic part of the non-discrimination obligation. Cost orientation is inherently more appropriate to enabling innovation and protecting end-user interest. Economic replicability test is a necessary complement to cost orientation. 7, contrary to what was put on the slide, what is said on price flexibility on Article 7, it's not something that a default position or anything like that. It's an option. In the English text says, shall consider. You just have to read it in the different languages and you will clearly understand that it's not a default position. It's an option. 8, most of us can certainly remember the time in secondary school where we made a calculation error at the beginning of the math test. The teacher didn't mark it with a 0, but checked the reasoning, and if it was right, we were likely to pass anyway. Okay. Here, can we conclude that they passed the test? For us, it would be very difficult to justify. However, we still would say, give some good points on some of the recommendations on access to civilian infrastructure. And my final remark goes on a call to the European Commission, something we already have made, and certainly now that with all the recommendations coming out of the study, democracy, transparency, and good governance require a full public consultation on the draft text. Thank you very much.
Paolo Grassia for ETNO, you can stay on the chair. There is no. Yeah. And thank you for taking over from Marit at such a short notice.
Definitely, and Marit is really sorry for not being able to be here, but in this period we can't be, can never be too prudent. So it was actually really an effort for her not to be here. I feel like a new kid on the block, on this block, but the good news is that Marit and I agree on the assessment of the study, and we would like to thank Mark and the team for this assessment. It is based on a wide assessment and involvement of stakeholders, various ETNO members and operators. So it's a good starting point to assess the state of the art of where we are now. We also welcome, of course, the review of the 2 recommendations. For us, it's really an opportunity to make sure that we take stock of the situation, we streamline the regulatory environment, and also match it up with the market dynamics that we are seeing. And this is a key point, because we do think that the revised recommendation should indeed take into account the new market dynamics and the new market needs present and for the next decade. So for us, the next 10 years should be the time horizon for the recommendation. It's essential, of course, to see what has worked, what has not worked over the past 10 years, 8 and 11 years, but it's all the more important to take into account what's going to happen. And I would like to also quote here a European Commission official that was present in one of our recent events a few days ago that said recommendations should be forward-looking and accommodating to the market dynamics. And we think this is a great quote that we should all bear in mind. When we talk about the current context, there are a few elements into play. Very high capacity network investment gap, forecast to 150 billion, coupled with a faster technological development and faster technological cycles, which means that also coupled with increase of data traffic, as we have heard, make all the more pressing a need of permanent investment. Then also large-scale fiber rollout by multiple operators. With public funding and with increased infrastructure-based competition, as we have discussed up to now, ongoing copper fiber switch-off and fiber migration, and also commercial agreements and co-investment efforts being put into market. And last but not least, also the new connectivity toolbox that will pave the way for more efficient implementation and a new BCRD. So this is the context we have to all take into account, which means that for the recommendation, we would really need a framework that support the connectivity goals, so very high capacity networks, and also that moves away from the conservative approach of service-based competition and looks at investment, infrastructure-based competition and investment. And there are several avenues for this to take place and to be achieved. For us, the cornerstone of this new approach is pricing. From the study, we have seen a lot of emphasis of pricing, and actually, I would like to briefly comment on the effort and the product that Mark presented to us, because on pricing, we do believe that the study is not forward-looking and future-oriented enough. And I would like to mention just like 4 points up for discussion and feedback, of course. I mean, one is price flexibility and the need to give a fresh approach and fresh look to the ERT. And we do think that some of the recommendation would also lead to stifling pricing flexibility and incentive for new investor rather than promoting that. This is the first point, but having said that, we do also agree with the broader scope of an equivalence in line with the code. Second point, some elements that should be more embraced and more be taken into account by the study and by consequence by the recommendation. Also, the recognitions of wholesale, collaborative, and co-investment models that are on top of what is foreseen by Article 76. These are interesting movement, interesting signal of investment commitment in the market, and for us, they should be taken into account as part of the framework for pricing flexibility. Equally, on the same vein, another element to be taken into account more duly is the long-term commitment discounts and volume discounts, because they are, as such, intrinsically a signal of a long-standing commitment of investment of very high-capacity network. So they should be taken into account in the as a basis for ERT, of course, on non-discriminatory basis. And the last point would be to rethink the approach on the cost of capital and talking of WACC, because we do think that the current legacy cost-based regulation is not fit for new investment. So we would encourage everyone to look also more interesting and more appealing approaches to new investors, like the fair bet principles. So these are just 4 of the elements that we would like to bring to the table, because price flexibility is, of course, the cornerstone for us of investment-inducing recommendations. There are, of course, other key pillars that have been abundantly discussed: physical infrastructure, copper fiber migration, non-discrimination. On this, the kind of tagline that we would like to use is flexibility, proportionality, flexibility on physical infrastructure access. We would encourage NRAs to, of course, take the framework and use it to model their approaches to the national circumstances, but also there are important measures to promote new investment that could be recommended as part of that, such as, for example, an exemption for new infrastructure investment during the first market analysis cycle. And on the copper fiber migration, there again, decision rests ultimately on the network owner. So flexibility and economic viability of the approach is something we call for, but also we would encourage NRAs to provide for a faster migration rate and also shorter notification period to 1 or 2 years to indeed encourage manage the process. And to this extent, we have to actually complement the mark. One of the last recommendations, I think, is the number 48 that they made, and we think is really useful to provide some clarity on the process for migration. All in all, I would like to pause here because I think there are a lot of elements to be discussed in a short time because we are probably running ahead of time. But just we thank again BEREC, Philippe, Mark for
Scott. Sorry, Paul.
Scott. Sorry,
Scott Marcus.
Scott, and everyone. We actually do look forward for the revision of the recommendations and stand ready to keep the dialogue open on how to maximize that.
Thank you. So we had the views of ECTA. ETNO, let's now go to a national regulator. Dan, what is PTS making of that study?
Thank you for the invitation to come here. The presentation we got from Scott was in quite a lot of detail and technical. I won't be going into that level. That would be difficult for me. I'd say at sort of the higher level, access regulation and investment both are very central to BEREC's ambitions of participating and ensuring that we get to close the digital divide, as we heard in the previous presentation, but of course also for users to have a choice in the market. My comments here today are not, you introduced me as PTS now kindly, and that's good because BEREC has not really adopted any position on the study. So I will basically speak as the national regulator, maybe some personal thoughts here as well, because we haven't really discussed the study at the national level either. And we have neither commissioned the study nor conducted the study, so it's in a sense nice to comment on work of others. But we do agree with what several speakers have said about this being timely. There have been lots of changes, obviously, in the marketplace since the current recommendations were issued. We have a new code which has introduced new objectives, as was mentioned earlier on, of connectivity and of take-up, and that should probably be reflected in the recommendation. Now, some key points. I will come back a couple of times to flexibility. I think flexibility is a key point for us as regulators. We should recognize that the market situation is far from the same in all of the member states. We are at different stages of development, and we have come. We have our history, our legacy, and things are happening at different speeds. So flexibility is important, and that comes to the set of remedies that can be used. We hope that the flexibility would not be reduced by the recommendation. Also for non-discrimination, we heard a discussion about equivalence of input and equivalence of output. I think also there it's important to maintain flexibility where possible, but to focus really on effective non-discrimination for markets to be able to develop in a good way for users and for closing that digital divide. I wanted to say a few words about the copper anchor that has been mentioned earlier on. My country is certainly one where the copper anchor seems to have lost its hold. We believe that the copper market is now a separate product market, probably from the fiber market all over the market. And then I've read with interest that the studies thinks about finding other anchor products. I think that might be an interesting idea. I'm not sure exactly what those other anchor products might be. I think this might indeed be quite challenging. And that's certainly what we're thinking when we look towards the future. The future is not necessarily going to be simpler. We have diminished the number of markets we regulate, but the remaining ones may not necessarily be easy ones for us as we look into the future. But having, if there is indeed a new anchor product, that might be a good idea. Non-price related discrimination is also in the study. I think this is a very interesting concept. It may well become more prevalent as we see more and more telcos becoming vertically integrated. There might be new opportunities, new incentives, new temptations. And non-price discrimination, I think, is going to be another challenge for us, which is going to be more difficult to act on than price discrimination. It's not so easy to investigate, and it's actually an area where our role as ex-ante regulators is becoming a little bit more like the competition authorities' role as ex-post regulators, because to spot the non-price discrimination, you will, I think, mostly find yourself in the ex-post scenario. Mm-hmm. And to predict that and to have the effective regulation there will be tricky. I won't go on very much longer, but I have a couple more points I wanted to make before I finish. And one of them was on cooperative or sharing agreements. I think Luc mentioned that. I think that is important to take into account. Are they becoming more prevalent in the future? I don't know, maybe. There are some signs to that, maybe. But we do have to take into account that we are moving to a 5-year cycle rather than a 3-year cycle, which makes it more important to factor in along the way or maybe review our regulation when big things happen in the marketplace, such as important sharing agreements or cooperative agreements. On the other hand, to balance that, we don't want to create regulatory uncertainty, because then I think we would get less of that investment that we so much want. So finding a good balance between those two interests is going to be important. And I think the last point I will make is back to what I mentioned about our future job, about regulating markets, the few remaining ones, and it's on the geographic scope of markets. I think this is going to be a key issue for us. We are in the midst of reviewing what is now Market 1 in Sweden, and we see that if you really look at a situation where either you have one SMP operator that has different kinds of competitive pressure in different areas of your market, or if you have very many, or many at least, it depends on which country you're in, operators that have sort of a monopoly on the retail customers in a small area. This is a new set of issues, and I think they come very much from what I just said about the copper anchor no longer being there, fiber becoming its own market, networks potentially also having to be seen as their own markets. And I think it's important that we get to terms with how to deal with this in a good way to continue to benefit investment, continue to benefit digital inclusion. Thank you.
Excellent point, I think. Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much. I'm looking at my watch. We have time for a few questions. Who would like to ask the first questions? While you think of, you polish, you sharpen your pencil for your next question, perhaps I would pick up a topic that is also in Kamila's portfolio, the WACC. You're also dealing with the WACC. Because I've heard different views, and maybe, Dan, you can hold the sway there. You know, I think we heard Scott saying, you know, looks as if the risk premium, you know, on the top of the legacy WACC for fiber is on the low side. We heard Luc saying, well, maybe it was true 10 years ago, but you know, today rolling out fiber is a bit more the new normal. So where is the risk? Paolo, so I don't know who wants to and then you think of what you know. Sweden being in the lead on fiber world, you'll tell us what you think, or whether there is we deserve a risk premium. Look, can you just elaborate a bit more on
Okay, so thank you, Philippe. And the WAC is of course an important topic, and even the more with the recent comment letter issued yesterday on the German case, but I will not comment on this one. So, first of all, in the slide that were presented and the way that Scott presented, I would strongly disagree with the presentation that by default they consider that operating and new networks would be more expensive than the legacy one. Because at the end, there are huge benefits of migrating from copper to fiber. There are strong energy benefits out of it because the electricity consumption and the CO2 consumption will, liberation is much lower. So that's the first point. So the first, and even the cost base used to start, I would totally disagree that you can prima facie say that it's higher. That needs to be analyzed and be the results of cost model. So that's the first very fundamental point. Then on the WACC, when we think about the risk premium and so on, I said it in my comments. So is it credible today to consider that it is an extra risk compared to anything kind of other investment to deploy fiber, knowing that, as I said, all companies have gained significant experience. So they have fiber deployments everywhere. So you know what the cost will be, you know the techniques, you know how the administration will react, you know what your management and your deployment team will do. 5 years ago, when I was discussing with investors, one of the main risks in companies that started fiber deployment was the managerial risk, because they say we don't know if they will be able to deliver. Today, look at all the companies that deploy fiber. They know what they do then. They are professionals. They have the skills. 10 years ago, when I was discussing as chairman of BIPT with Belgacom and Didier Bellens, the CEO told me, but deploying fiber, yeah, it will take years to do that, and then the skills are not available. Today, the skills are there. You see? The demand side. We also say, yeah, but we don't know if people will use fiber. This must be a joke. Or can we everywhere communicate from Europe, we have the big targets, digital and so on, and say that's the future and so on, and then say, but damn, we don't know if people will buy it. Come on, look at what the market says. What does the market say? Do you think that you can still sell a copper product in Spain? If you have no choice, maybe, but where there is fiber, if you would say to your neighbors or to your kids would kill you. My son, 16 years old, is a gamer. Every day he asks me, when will we have fiber? Every day. So at the end,
look, if you may, I play the devil's advocate, but I have no dogs in the fight.
You like to do that,
So, true for, and we'll come to Sweden in a minute, where every consumers love their fiber, just like the Spanish and but is it not that when you look at where member states stand today, roughly half of the member states, telcos have rolled out at 100 megabit per second, using a combination of fiber and fast VDSL. But in half of the member states, the industry is rolled out to satisfy 80% of population. But then you look at the take-up, where the consumers, like your son, reach for their wallet and decided to buy the product. And then, yes, you've got Switzerland, which is not, IRG, Sweden, Spain doing well. Then you've got a bunch of countries, some of them rich, not poor countries, that are not taking. So, if you allow me, look, just looking at that graph showing the take-up for 100 megabits per second, I wonder whether we can say there is no commercial risk.
No, but Philippe, I think there is a good point, and there are multiple dimensions on that. And let's look at. So I would like to compare two countries. France, and why France? Because France is probably the most competitive country in Europe on the retail side. And you just have to compare the prices in Belgium with those of France. And there are many debates in Belgium about, because the French medias are well penetrated in Belgium. And there you see that investments are higher year after year. Year after year, for 5-6 years. Now, in 2020, I think it was, they invested 10.4 billion, which was more than the year before, and so on, in a very competitive context. Then look at the opposite. Look at Germany. where does Germany stand? And I don't speak, I could give also the example of UK, because UK, Germany are, but I will not do it because, yeah, because of the Brexit. And also because OpenReach is something, it's well documented in the report, but you cannot generalize or take any conclusion from OpenReach because, yeah, it's not, yeah, it's a particular case. But look at Germany. Germany, Deutsche Telekom, has not invested in fiber for years. They could have done. What happens? You see alternative operators, new companies, Deutsche Glasfaser, Eurofiber, and all, that begin to invest in fiber. And what you see now, suddenly, that Deutsche Telekom wake up. The same in the UK and so on. So now, taking these countries as an example and say, yeah, but the risk was high and so on, and say we need higher prices or we need it. Give me a break,
Thank you. No, we heard you.
Could have started
we heard
10
you.
years ago.
We heard you. No. Thank you. I think you made your point very clearly. I think. Yeah. Let's move now to Paolo. Do you wish to comment on?
Yeah, maybe we can take it offline. And,
bon, okay. So, voilà. Alors, Dan, would you say before? And I know Sweden is not agenda, but would you say that? Well, is there an extra risk of laying out fiber rather than exploiting your traditional telecom network? And if there is a risk, do you see it more on the supply side, the risk of any engineering program, or do you see it more on the demand side, the fact that in some countries consumers are not as eager as the Swedes to buy fiber?
Well, this could be a session of its own, I think, Philippe. I'm not sure we have time to go into all the details, but I can tell you a few facts. We regulate only Telia, the ex-incumbent, at wholesale level, and they have like maybe barely 40% market share, and that's the old regulation. But we have like 170 or so network operators that provide their own network. So most of them are not, it's market-based rolled out, and currently not price regulated, which means that we don't sort of have to regulate the premium of anything. But access works. There is a model with open networks where you can switch between your service suppliers. And the way future is, as I said, a little bit more complex. So what will we do moving forward? We're in the middle of investigating that. Yeah. So that's a short summary of where we are.
Thank you, Dan. I will now hand over to you, Kamila, for what do you take away from this short debate? We certainly didn't do justice to Scott and Christian's study, nor to the subject itself. But what do you take from the study itself and from this conversation, Kamila?
Thank you.
And remind us a little bit of the process. What is your calendar for? What is the path to the new recommendation?
Thanks a lot. I think by definition we are here at the Stakeholders Forum, so I think it's a forum for stakeholders to express their views. What I can say from the Commission point of view, indeed we are reviewing both access recommendations. I don't know if you wanted me, Philippe, to comment first on WACC, or can I already
you can have
please, time, because I think we already
if you could
are de facto
make a quick decision on this Swiss premium, that would be much appreciated.
And my intervention, I guess, is in between the drinks, or rather just before the drinks that we are supposed to have. So I would be relatively short. I think on important aspect of this review, as you see also from the discussion before, it raises a lot of attention and a lot of concerns. And as you see also from intervention from Luc and Paolo, well, they go quite into opposite directions, let's put it this way. What I see, and I would like to thank very much Scott and Christian, who was here, the authors of the study, that I think they were really trying to do very, very good job into looking into the application of these recommendations throughout the last decade. They were also looking very much into evidence coming from different markets. Each market is a bit different, each evidence is different. And they came with several recommendations. which I think are very much worth looking into. We had here just a brief overview of main elements of this recommendation, but main elements of the study, but the study is much larger with a lot of interesting evidence to which I would like to refer you to. And I think they were also trying to take into account both the market changes, but very importantly also to take into account that the code is now in place. And here I a bit disagree with some of the comments before. I really think that we should operate on the basis of the code. The fact that the transposition is postponed or delayed in some member states, I think is a just very unfortunate coincidence, because we are not benefiting from what is coming from the code for the incentives for very high capacity networks. So that's also our big plea from the Commission, that the transposition should be as quickly done as possible and as close to the provisions of the code as it is as well possible. So for me, the starting position, if we are looking at the access recommendation for the next 10 years, and I agree this is basically what we are looking to, there are several elements to take into account when we will be issuing it. I think the first one is we are in completely different world than we had been 10 years ago. We have completely different market developments. Dan was referring to the situation in Sweden with fiber deployment that is absolutely amazing and very interesting for all of us to follow. We had very interesting discussions with other colleagues from Denmark, looking at their market with the fiber take-up and fiber deployment. I think this is unprecedented, but not every market is the same. I think there are so many differences in Europe that we also need to take them into account when we write the recommendation. But the starting point, especially that we are looking into forward-looking approach, not where we are exactly standing now, but what will be needed for the next 10 years to guide the work of regulators, how to apply access remedies to the market. It needs to be based on the code provisions. So the starting point is the code right now, and it's the starting point, because we'll have to see how the code provisions will be implemented. I think this is the most important, and I think something that nobody questions in this room, and this been questioned neither by Luc or Paolo, and for sure not by Dan, that we simply need to change these recommendations. The recommendations that were adopted in 2010 and 2013 are not up to what is current situation on different markets. They are not up to the provisions of the code. They are not up to the regulatory framework, and they will not sustain the next 10 years. It is super difficult exercise. This is what I can tell you. You see already on the basis of this discussion, there are very much diverse views. There are different markets. There are different market situations that we have to take into account. And recommendation from the Commission should give guidance to NRAs that can be more universally used. So this needs to be really reflecting the common ground and be able to provide guidelines that could be useful for the market stability, for the regulatory stability, but also for the work of the NRAs. So, as I said, I agree fully with Scott that the starting point, and many of you before, should be the code, but we need to really look forward. And in order to look forward, there are several things to take into account. First of all, the way the regulators are regulating the markets under the code is first to look into retail market problem. Are we really having problem at the retail level? And how this market failure can be remedied. Then we see from the regulatory practice much more focus by regulators in what already Dan mentioned, both the product market definition and geographic market definition. It's interesting that we are meeting here, Dan, because I started looking into competition law provisions with you and under your direction, and I see that we are back to the same. We really need to base our assessment on what very proper competition analysis, and this one is starting with the retail market problem, with the product market definition. Dan mentioned here the differences between copper and fiber product markets currently seen in the Swedish context, and geographic market analysis. Indeed, we are going much more deeper into the geographic market analysis on the local or even regional or regional or even local markets. And finally, the access recommendation is based on the provision that we are talking about SMP operators, significant market power operators. And this is a starting point of view. So the way until the access regulation can be imposed is quite long. There are several aspects that needs to be taken into account in a very sophisticated analysis that are done currently by regulators and that we see. Starting from the SMP regulation, there are also several other aspects that we are also looking into, and that's why when we are reviewing these recommendations, we are looking into what is happening with the review of Broadband Cost Reduction Directive, and we are also working very closely with my colleagues from Carlota's policy unit that are currently reviewing BCRD. And we also want to make sure, now talking about a bit timeline, that both reviews are meeting each other also in terms of the timeline. So you asked me about our timeline. Well, I could a little bit say that it very much depends on the colleagues in this room, because it's the same team that is reviewing different notifications that are coming from national regulatory authorities. Currently, it's a high season and big wave of notifications coming to us. We need also room for reflection and internal discussions that is currently ongoing. It's not to disincentivize anyone here in this room or incentivize to notify more, but I'm also saying that we have to take it into account, not only because of the amount of work, but also because of what is currently happening on the market and how different regulatory approaches are already showing how in the future regulation might look like. Because what is extremely important to mention, the study by Visionary Analytics and prepared by Scott and Christian is a very important element for our assessment, but we are also looking into results of the public consultation that we did, and many of you participated. We are also looking into regulatory practice. So we are very much looking into different decisions that were analyzed by us and prepared by regulators within the last 10-year time frame, and in particular now, because we really, this is a big changing point. In terms of timeline, we are planning to ask for BEREC opinion in Q1 of next year, so this will for sure come back to regulators. We are very much open to discussions. Luc made a clear plea for transparency. We always respect the transparency. When we consult with BEREC, we always, for information purpose, publish it for the other comments. And as Luc knows very well, and colleagues from ETNO as well, our door for discussions are very much open. I think we might have, in fact, quite a few meetings with colleagues from both ETNO and ECTA to discuss exactly the provisions. So that would be a bit my take. We are planning to issue, that means that the recommendation will be most likely issued by the half of next year, depending a little bit on the work done and on the BEREC opinion. So that's a bit our timing. The focus would be, as I said, the starting point would be the code. We will look into all interesting elements which are recognized by the code that are happening on the markets, which is, of course, the issue mentioned by colleagues from ETNO on commercial agreements, on co-investment, on all market initiatives that are on the market. This is also something that needs to be recognized in the context of this recommendation, that we should, and as the code is saying, we should look into this development when we are proposing specifically access recommendation. Then the second big topic would be indeed price flexibility, under which circumstances this should be recommended. Of course, very important, if no price flexibility, how the pricing of fiber should be done, on what it should be based. So that's very important topic that gets a lot of attention. Civil engineering, very, very important chapter for us, because this is under the code the main access remedy recommended for NRAs to look in the first place when they are thinking about regulation. And there are a lot of very interesting questions, for example, about how to price access to civil engineering, depending if we are talking about ducts that are already in place or the new build ducts, and how to take into account depreciation. So this is very important. I think migration topic would be super important for us to cover in this recommendation, and something that was also mentioned by Dan, geographic segmentation of the remedies. We put a lot of emphasis on them when we were discussing relevant market recommendation. When we look at the geographic market dimension, here it would be also very much taken into account in the proposed recommendation. So that's a bit very quick overview. Many topics, very complex, and we are looking forward to have discussion with all of you.
Thank you very much, Kamila. Thank you all. Please join me in thanking our panelists. I'm sorry about the timekeeping. I would like to now invite Anne-Marie, thank you very much, Luc, to join me on stage for a few closing remarks.
As you already said, Philippe, as you already said, I think regulators are sometimes funny people. The fact that we really relish content-rich discussions like we just had. Thank you so much for attending this stakeholder forum. Thank you so much for, on behalf of BEREC, to join us in 2 stakeholder forums in 1 year, one digital and today finally physical. Let me not take up too much time. Let me just mention and express my gratitude to BEREC office for again making this possible in this physical form, and my master of ceremony Bert, who thought of this program and invited all these guests. And I am looking forward to sharing a drink with you outside. See you again somewhere next year. I'm really looking forward to it. I think we have our work cut out for us. There's a lot of work to do, and it will be fun, I assure you. And I will looking forward, as I said, to meeting you in doing that. Thank you so much.